So, let's talk about Benito Mussolini. You've definitely heard the name, and you for sure know the term fascism. But his story is so much more than just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a playbook, and today we're going to break down exactly how he wrote it.
And his story really forces us to ask one of the most vital questions of our time. How does a democracy actually die? Because, as you're about to see, it's often not with some big, loud explosion, but with a quiet handshake.
All right, so our story kicks off with a massive contradiction. I mean, it's a wild ideological journey. The man who'd invent fascism actually started out as a diehard socialist.
And yeah, those contradictions were there right from birth. Just look at this. On one side you have his father, Alessandro, a really fervent socialist. On the other, his mother, Rosa, a devout Catholic. I mean, can you just imagine the dinner table conversations in that house? It basically shaped a young Mussolini to be rebellious and, frankly, to thrive on conflict.
And he poured all that energy into his dad's politics. And you know what? He was amazing at it. By 1912, he wasn't just some socialist, he was the editor of the party's main newspaper, Avanti. He was a total rising star, one of the biggest voices on the Italian left.
But then, World War I happened, and this was the moment that changed absolutely everything. The socialists, they wanted Italy to stay neutral. But Mussolini, he saw something totally different. He saw chaos and he saw opportunity. He started to believe the war could be this giant revolutionary fire, one that could just sweep away the old world and build something new from the ashes.
Well, for the Socialist Party, this was a complete betrayal. They kicked him out, boom, just like that in 1914. But he landed on his feet. He immediately started a new nationalist newspaper, and guess who funded it? The very same industrialists who were desperate for Italy to join the war. He'd made his choice. Nationalism over socialism.
So that huge ideological flip set the stage for his next act, the march to power. And this is where we'll see how he became a master at exploiting a nation's chaos.
Now, to really get how he rose so fast, you have to understand the atmosphere in Italy at the time. And it's all captured in this one term, the Biennio Rosso, which basically means the 2 red years. Between 1919 and 1920, the whole country was just paralyzed by strikes and factory takeovers. The people in charge were absolutely terrified of a communist revolution, just like the one that had just happened in Russia.
And this fear wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was piled on top of a nation that was already a total mess. Italians were enraged about what they called the mutilated victory, feeling totally ripped off by their allies after the war. The economy was a disaster. We're talking crippling inflation, massive unemployment. It really felt like society was just coming apart at the seams.
And into this mess steps Mussolini, offering a very simple, very brutal solution: violence. He created these paramilitary squads, the Black Shirts, and just unleashed them to beat down and crush his political opponents. And the establishment, the politicians, the business leaders, for the most part, they just looked the other way. They saw these thugs as, a necessary evil to stop the communists.
This all leads up to the famous March on Rome in 1922, which was honestly one of the greatest political bluffs of all time. So here's what happens. He threatens a coup, right? But the Italian army could have stopped him easily. Instead, the king just panicked. He was terrified of a civil war, so he refused to call in the army. Instead, he just picks up the phone, calls Mussolini, and legally makes him prime minister. So the big scary march, it was just a victory parade after he'd already been handed the keys to the government.
So he's prime minister. Game over, right? Nope, not even close. Becoming prime minister was just the beginning. Now we get to the part where he forges the totalitarian state, a process that, believe it or not, didn't happen overnight.
For about 3 years, he kept up this thin disguise of democracy. But the real breaking point was the Mattiati crisis in 1924. A socialist leader, Giacomo Mattiati, stood up in Parliament and bravely called out all the fraud the fascists had used in the election. A few days later, he was kidnapped and murdered. The country was shocked, and for a minute there, it looked like Mussolini's government might actually fall.
This was the moment of truth. On January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini walks into Parliament, and instead of backing down, he does the exact opposite. He gives this incredibly bold speech, taking full responsibility. With these words, he basically dared anyone to challenge him. He dropped the mask and openly declared his dictatorship for the whole world to see.
And after that speech, the gloves were completely off. He moved so fast. Boom! All other political parties were banned. Freedom of the press?
Gone. He set up a secret police, the OVRA. He got rid of independent trade unions and replaced them with state-run organizations, and the whole thing was wrapped up in this massive propaganda machine that created the cult of Il Duce, painting him as the one and only savior of Italy.
But his ambition wasn't just to control Italy. He was dreaming of a new Roman Empire, and in 1935 he invaded Ethiopia. Well, the rest of the world condemned him for it, which pushed him away from his old allies like Britain and France and straight into the arms of the one leader in Europe who actually admired him, Adolf Hitler.
And that, of course, brings us to the final tragic chapter of his story, the Pact and the Fall. This was the fatal alliance that would ultimately seal his doom.
By 1938, Hitler's influence on him was undeniable. In what was a truly shameful move, Mussolini, whose own movement hadn't really been built on anti-Semitism, started to copy his German ally. He passed the racial laws which systematically stripped Italian Jews of their rights, their citizenship, their jobs, paving the way for the horrors that were to come.
He jumped into World War II in 1940, thinking it would be a quick and easy win. It was a complete disaster. And just look at this timeline. You can see how fast it all unraveled. By July 1943, the Allies were in Sicily. At that point, even his own fascist Grand Council turned on him and voted him out of power. He was arrested and then finally, in April 1945, captured and executed by Italian partisans as he was trying to escape the country.
So, after all that, we have to come back to the big question. Why are we still talking about him? Why does Mussolini still matter today? Well, the answer is in the legacy he left behind, his playbook.
Look, Mussolini's #1 legacy is the political system he literally invented, fascism. He was the original. He was the first to mix together that toxic cocktail of extreme nationalism, total state control, glorifying the military, and building this intense cult of personality around one leader. Other dictators, most famously Hitler, were watching and taking notes.
And that is exactly why his story is so important. It's the ultimate case study in how a modern democracy can be taken apart, piece by piece, not by an invading army, but from the inside.
He basically gave the world the recipe, and the ingredients are terrifyingly simple. You start with a huge economic crisis. You add a deep, burning sense of national humiliation, and then you mix in a whole lot of social fear. In that kind of environment, a strong man who promises to restore order can start to look like the only answer.
Which leaves us all with one final, and pretty heavy, question to think about. If that's the recipe, what are the warning signs we should be looking out for in any democracy today?